Hello there. The seriousness of this cannot be overstated. It may not be apparent yet, but farmers are bringing the globalists to their knees, and now the Greek farmers have joined the battle. Don't think for 1 minute that just because the protests are not continuous in one geographical area that the protests are not growing. Far from it. Because each individual country has its protest days and weeks, only for farmers to return home to continue to feed us as they prepare to then regroup. And crucially, once all protests across Europe are fully coordinated, we will see the true power of our farmers. And right now they are definitely flexing their muscles, with the latest group to join being the farmers of Greece. The police estimate was that 8,000 Greek farmers fronted up in Athens with about 130 tractors, with Reuters reporting that they parked on Syntagma Square in front of Parliament in their biggest protest yet over rising costs. And echoing the pledges of other farmers across Europe, one Greek farmer said, "We're not afraid and we're not going home." Now the establishment, across Europe, was no doubt relying on narrow profit margins and competition to keep the farmers stuck to their tractor seats in the fields as they worked night and day to make a crust, and therefore be far too busy to fight back, while the office-closeted net zero bureaucrats legislated their farmers' livelihoods away. That's a great way to break the opposition, isn't it? Set up a system where your target, in this case the farmers, are buried in ever-increasing red tape, ever-rising costs and ever-dwindling income, while reducing subsidies and fuel tax breaks so as to drive them out of business or just generally grind them into the ground. And don't forget the enforced rewilding of a proportion of their land and the planting of trees. Just keep the legislative and financial pressure on until they break and give up farming. And part of that system is ensuring there is a ready supply of possibly inferior but much cheaper imported food that will bite ever further into the domestic farmers' profits. Which is why Polish farmers are at the Ukraine border stopping Ukrainian grain right now and other produce getting into the EU, including dumping the grain where they possibly can. Now overall you get the idea that there is a big push on to completely dismantle the West, something I'll come on to in a minute. Looking at EU and UK agricultural policy, I can see no other reasonable conclusion than they want to grind the West to dust. But it's also having wider implications. For example, these net zero policies have put in train events that threaten the EU's support for Ukraine. Now, it doesn't matter which side of that particular fence you're on. The farmers are upset not because of EU support for Ukraine per se, but because of the way the EU and their governments have decided to help Ukraine by letting Ukrainian grain and other produce to be sold into the EU tariff-free. That puts EU farmers' profits on the hook for lower prices. And this attitude is not restricted to Polish farmers. So the EU and member state governments' push for a net zero destruction of their own agricultural systems has ignited a foreign and defence policy crisis for the West. Not only will Putin's Russia be smiling, the globalists will also be ecstatic. Why? Because if you control the food, you control the people. So the globalists are trying to wrest control of the world's food supply system for their own ends. And to do that, you need to destroy the existing system first. And all this is being driven using the argument that we must screw down on agriculture to save the planet by reducing CO2 and methane emissions. And because some of the farmers, like those in Greece, are complaining about the claimed climate change-related issues of compensation for flooded farmland, the Eco Brigade are saying it reinforces their argument for net zero. except it doesn't. If climate change is man activity driven, then it all hinges on man's activities across the planet, not just in one geographical area. And here's the annual CO2 emissions from our world in data, where you can see that the US, the EU and the UK are already driving these emissions down. But there is one big outlier in the form of China and another growing outlier, India. So shutting down farms and jobs in the UK and the EU is going to make diddly squat change to the overall picture. Now take a look at the other greenhouse gases as well, nitrous oxide and methane. It's exactly the same picture. While the Western world self-strangulates and drives itself into poverty, China is turning into the production hub of the world and making all the profit. Look at how much those methane emissions have gone up for China for a start, and the nitrous oxide. And for the UK eco-loons, just take a look at where the UK is on these graphs, a mere sliver of emissions. And our eco-zealots say we must do ever more. My answer is that it's no good doing more if it means we can no longer sustain ourselves in food, energy or manufacturing. Just look at our now almost non-existent steel-making capacity. Anyway, it won't just be the farmers who will be involved in future protests, as lorry drivers, taxi drivers and other sectors of society who have had enough of the establishment and its net zero lunacy will also join in. And there are also rumblings in other parts of the world, as Yahoo Finance reports. Elsewhere, Indian farmer groups have taken to the streets this month to demand price guarantees, and in the US, farmers are complaining they're priced out by big companies. Are we about to see farming activism in the US too? Oh, and here's another chart showing the relationship between CO2 emissions per capita and GDP per capita. Funny old thing, but as emissions per capita increases, so does GDP per capita, with those on the right-hand edge being more efficient with their emissions. And GDP per capita is an indicator of how wealthy an individual is likely to be in any given country. If the eco-zealots are correct, there must be a fully green country somewhere at the bottom of the chart near the $100,000 mark. But there isn't, even after decades of wind and solar. Data does not lie. Oh, and that little green dot in the top right-hand corner showing the country with the most GDP per capita and the most emissions per capita is Qatar. Now look at China and India with their huge populations. To move to the right along the GDP per capita scale, they are going to have to move significantly up the emissions per capita scale. And that would mean huge increases in emissions given the sheer number of people they have living there. Hence this graph that I showed you earlier, where you can see the ever-increasing CO2 outputs. But as ever, it is the developed West that must bear the brunt of doing the most while being the least of the problem. So a mission to drive Western economies into a lower emissions mode will, as I see it, also drive them further down the GDP per capita wealth scale. Let that sink in. And while that happens, we'll be producing less energy and less food, while in contrast our governments, of whatever political hue, continue to keep our borders wide open, further driving down our GDP per capita. National bankruptcy, dear viewer, must be inevitable. And UK GDP per capita has stagnated since 2007, as has that of France and Germany, for example. But look at Chinese GDP per capita since then. It's increased by about 4.5 times. You get the general picture. Let's be clear. If our establishments truly believed in their own net zero pronouncements, they would pull all investments out of China and reshore all energy production and manufacturing, then use the latest tech to make it as energy efficient as possible. But their policies are having the opposite effect. Now, why would that be? Please like, subscribe and comment below.